Hello, and welcome to Coping with Loss in a Pandemic, the COVID-19 series. My name is Tom Anthony, and I'll be your moderator for the next few videos. Our purpose in this series is to provide information to those who lose loved ones during pandemics. We specifically reference COVID-19 because that is what is occurring right now. This series is designed for those of us who have lost a loved one during the pandemic, whether that be a COVID death itself, an unrelated death, or a death by an economic or social consequence of the pandemic, such as a suicide or unintentional overdose. This series is also for people who want to understand and help assist anyone who has experienced these losses. The series is comprised of 3 videos. Part 1, Loss and Trauma, discussing the losses and traumas that have presented themselves to us during this pandemic, which create challenges for all of us, but particularly for those of us who lose loved ones during this time. Part 2, 12 Coping Strategies, looks at specific steps you can take right now to cope with the loss of your loved one during the pandemic. And Part 3, Loss Over Time, looks at how to move forward with your loss after the pandemic and into the future. We are lucky to be joined by 2 world-renowned experts for this series. Dr. Therese Rando, the founder and clinical director for the Institute for the Study and Treatment of Loss in Warwick, Rhode Island. A practicing clinical psychologist, she is identified as one of the world's foremost experts on sudden and traumatic loss. And Dr. Kenneth J. Doka, the senior consultant to the Hospice Foundation of America. A prolific author in the field of dying, death, and bereavement, he is acknowledged as one of its preeminent leaders. Now, without further ado, welcome to Coping with Loss in a Pandemic, the COVID-19 series. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for Coping with Loss During a Pandemic, the COVID-19 series. My name is Tom Anthony, and today we are talking about loss and trauma in a pandemic, specifically the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. We are talking to you who has been impacted. You've lost someone, you've lost something. I think we've all lost something during this pandemic. And I'm joined by 2 world-renowned experts in the field. And how are both of you today?
Good, thank you.
Very, very well, thank you.
So let's get right into it. First off, so what really makes the COVID-19 pandemic different?
Well, it's a good question. I think there's a lot of things that make it different. First of all, deaths are sudden and often unpredictable, and that's one of the problems. It's a new disease. It's really not well understood. We know that it runs the range from people who are asymptomatic but can still pass the disease to those that have minor symptoms, cold-like, more serious symptoms, flu-like, and then obviously in somewhat less than 5% of the cases, it seems, can be a life-threatening and does take the lives of people. So the fact that we don't understand it very well, we don't know, for example, if the antibodies that some people show will actually prevent reinfection. There's just a lot we don't know about this disease. Another factor that makes it very complicated is that we're isolated, we're quarantined, we have travel restrictions. And as we're going to talk about later on, then we can't provide the support we'd like to people. I had a friend of mine who died of another cause, and normally I would have gone to the funeral, but the family said, well, we're not going to have anything at this point in time because of limitations and travel restrictions and things of that nature. And these put tremendous limits on the rituals that surround dying and death, rituals that really are very, very helpful to help us cope with death and dying. And then there are very deep issues of spirituality and meaning. People have asked, why is this occurring now, and what's the meaning of it? And, questions we really can't answer at all. So these are some of the factors, I think, but there are a number of other factors, which I think Dr. Rando will talk about.
Yes, I think it's important for us to have an understanding when we're mourning loved ones who've died in a pandemic. It's really important to understand that we're not just dealing solely with the loss, we're dealing with trauma as well. So let's speak a little bit about loss and trauma in the context of this. First of all, there are two main kinds of losses. You can have a death loss and you can have a non-death loss. A death loss would be the loss of your loved one. A non-death loss can be of two types. It can be physical. You lose something that's physical, perhaps your home, or perhaps you have an amputation of your leg. It is the loss of a tangible object. And you can also have an abstract loss. This is an intangible loss, such as the loss of your job or the loss of your belief in how your life was going to go once you perhaps lost your job because of this pandemic. Now, there's a very special case of an abstract loss that's really important to understand for those of you who are coping with the loss of a loved one in this pandemic. And that's when there's been a violation of your worldview. Your worldview, this is something that every one of us has our own particular worldview that we have developed over time as we've grown up. And basically it has to do with how we expect the world to work, people to be, life to go, what we believe about our God or our ourselves, how we perceive ourselves in the sense of how we're going to go through life, the occupations we're going to have, those things that are meaningful to us and so forth. And so we have this worldview. And when life gives us something that violates that worldview or shatters it, then we are dealing with the fact that we actually have an abstract loss. We no longer have our job. We no longer have our sense of ourselves as a provider if we have lost that position and now have to rely on some kind of assistance to take care of our children. And one of the things that's very difficult in this pandemic is that individuals are dealing not only with physical losses, but they're dealing with many of these abstract losses as well. And just because a loss can't be touched, just because it's abstract, doesn't mean it doesn't need to be grieved. And so that is a real problem. We're not only coping with losses of loved ones, but then many other losses as well. Some of these losses we consider to be secondary losses. They come as a result of the loss of our loved one. Perhaps if we lose our partner in the pandemic, we lose a confidant, a sexual partner, someone who helped us with our children, someone who helped us be the best that we can be. So these are concepts of loss that we have to understand because it's too simple to just say, well, we've lost someone. In fact, there are many different kinds of losses that visit us. And then when we're talking about trauma, we have to appreciate that trauma takes place in this loss, in this pandemic. A trauma is an event that you perceive as inescapable, that confronts you with a actual death or serious injury. And that injury may be physical, psychological, social, spiritual, and injury to yourself or to someone else. And when something's traumatic, the standard operating procedure doesn't work. We can't necessarily get ourselves out of it at that particular point. And that causes us to be very much into the fight, flight, or freeze reaction, which causes us to start to operate just to try to survive. So our brain is operating at a less sophisticated level than usual. Coping abilities may be compromised. We have a lot of stress and dysfunction, and our worldview can be violated. And when a person has a traumatic experience, they can range all the way from reactions that can be PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, to less formal reactions, but still debilitating reactions, a lot of anxiety, nervousness, restlessness, feeling depressed, and so forth. And what we're seeing in this pandemic is that we have what's called traumatic bereavement. That's the state of having suffered a loss when the grief over that loss is complicated or overpowered by the traumatic circumstances of the loss or by the events that are going on that are associated with those circumstances. Mm-hmm. So when you've not had the opportunity to have the luxury, if you will, of paying attention to your loved one's loss because you're trying to homeschool your children, you have not been able to secure financial assistance, you're worried about your own mortality and the mortality of other people, that this can be traumatizing in and of itself, and it can end up compromising your ability to focus on the grief of your loved one. And we know that whenever you're dealing with a traumatic bereavement, as you are, if you're dealing with the loss of a loved one in this pandemic, whether it be from COVID-19 itself, whether it be from a non-COVID death that occurred during this pandemic, or whether it was a death that resulted because of the circumstances of the pandemic, some of the so-called deaths of despair, a suicide, an unintentional overdose, that any of those deaths, if a person's trying to mourn them now, going to be infused with trauma. And then that means that you will need to cope with your own personal traumatization, as well as with dealing with the loss of your loved one, and then dealing with the fact that the trauma loss combination means that sometimes what you need to do to cope with your trauma, perhaps to back off, not think about the death, can compromise the grief, where you need to reminisce about the person. And what you need to do to cope with your grief, perhaps to think about your loved one, can compromise coping with your trauma, because you may think of the person as you imagine they were in the hospital when they were dying alone. So there are some challenges that do come up with the coincidence of trauma and loss. Fortunately, they're not insurmountable, but they are challenges.
Definitely, it does. It really sounds like this pandemic does create distinct issues for grieving individuals, whether it be someone died or they lost something else. And I think across the spectrum, we're seeing this loss and trauma on a mass scale. Everybody's life has been disrupted. But so there are more special issues relating to the person who actually dies of COVID-19, are there?
Yes. If you've not been able to be, and Ken talked about this, with your loved one at the time of the death, not being able to say goodbye, not being able to have rituals, and guilt. This is a big thing. We find that many people are feeling guilty because they couldn't be with the person at the end. They couldn't say, I love you, couldn't say goodbye. There may be survivor guilt. I'm going on and they're not going on. There may be guilt because it seems so unreal. And many people have said that. I didn't get to see their body. I didn't get to participate in things that would have made me be able to really realize that this was happening. So
I'm just going to say, and as you're talking about guilt, I think it's also important to recognize that, that this is a contagious disease, and some may feel guilty that they brought it into the house, and maybe they were asymptomatic or had a very mild case, but maybe their grandmother died of it. So there's a lot of guilt factors potentially here.
Right. And the thing about guilt is that even if you're feeling guilty for something that you really shouldn't feel guilty for, what a psychologist might call, quote, illegitimate guilt, it feels just as real as legitimate guilt. So you can't determine yourself just by your feeling whether or not it's guilt that's fair to assume or not. And so that's one of the things that comes up for people.
When I taught my grief mourning and bereavement class, counseling class, I used to say grief doesn't have to be rational to be real.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So these are some of the things that become difficult. You're also dealing with people who, as they're contending with a loved one who's died with COVID-19, has heightened anxiety among many other things. Their job, their welfare, their economic insecurity, what kinds of world can they trust is going to be there? They're unsure of things, uncertainty, loss of routine, loss of milestone events, not being able to have personal freedom. And of course, all of these things can trigger old losses, old traumas, old abandonments of in our past. And this can contribute to to compounding some of what we're dealing with at the present situation. Again, it's not something that cannot be handled, but right now, as we're trying to sketch out for you some of the things that are on your plate to deal with, you can see that it is somewhat complicated.
Complicated indeed. Now, Ken, what about persons who die of other causes? What about
Yeah,
them?
well, I think a lot of the same issues arise that Dr. Rando has spoken about. For example, again, they're dying alone, they're grieving alone. There's the lack of rituals, all those other factors. But I think another factor is that grief can often be disenfranchised. The way I describe this is I had an aunt who died on September 12th, 2001. She died well into her 90s. She died surrounded by her family, peacefully easing away in a coma. And whenever I mentioned I was going to a funeral on the 13th or 14th, people would almost look excited at me, say, did the person die in 9/11? And I would say, no, she died in her bed at 93 years old. And there's even a sort of a funny family story about that. Because when the priest did his funeral sermon for my aunt, he started out by saying, "This is not one of those tragic deaths." And the family always jokes that I did the graveside ceremony, and they call it the graveside rebuttal, because I said this was a tragic death for us.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of that also occurs in COVID. We are very aware of how a person who's maybe 45 dies of COVID. It's terrible, and it is. But any death is terrible, and any death affects survivors. And sometimes people who have non-COVID deaths really feel that their losses aren't being acknowledged and recognized. And of course, like Dr. Rando said, there can be many other emotionally complicating factors. There might be a cosmic anger because of this disease. What I call a cosmic anger, because of this disease. I was not able to be by my father's side when he died of cancer, or I was not able to go to my cousin's funeral in Ohio, coming from New York, because I couldn't travel. And there are all these kinds of issues that arise that make that so. Any death in this period of time can be complicating, and you may not be experiencing COVID death as you watch this video, but you may be saying, but my dad died, or my mom died, or my grandparent died, or wherever it is, your partner, and saying, and yet all the attention is on these deaths. What about the other deaths? And that can be a complicating factor as well.
Definitely complicates it, very much so. And so, Terry, you were speaking about non-death losses previously. Can you go into that a little more and how that grief is complicated as well in this time we're in?
Well, I think the notion of how we thought the world should be, how we thought we are going to be going through our life, what our life path was. So if you have been preparing, for instance, to graduate from college, and then you, first of all, don't even get to graduate, except for some virtual recognition. And perhaps the job market is not what you would have wanted it to be. And what are you going to do now? Or you've worked a long time to develop this restaurant, and now it is precarious at best if you can continue, or perhaps you've had to close. We as human beings have hopes and dreams and expectations. And one of the things that's very insidious about this pandemic is that there have been so many changes with the lockdowns, with the limitations that were put on us, that many of our other aspects of our lives have been very adversely affected by this, so that we can't go do the kinds of things that we thought we were going to be able to do. I know many individuals are very distressed by not being able to celebrate the milestones, the weddings that have not been able to happen, or that this happened with the bride and the groom, and perhaps a virtual celebration. That we need to understand that we're not dealing with just death losses, but non-death losses as well. And some of them are going to be very, very profound for us. There are people who've become very angry at their God. How could this happen? And there are people then who say, well, it could be so much worse. I'm so grateful for what I have. And then they can't let themselves be upset for the things that they don't have because they feel, well, it's not as bad as somebody else. So these are the kinds of things that we know are happening. And for those of you who are listening, we want you to pay attention and to recognize the losses that you've had and to look at them without judgment and to look at them how you would perceive them if someone else had them and allow yourself to identify them. In the next video, we'll be talking about how to cope with those losses, but it's really important that you legitimize them and not try to talk yourself out of them and say, well, I shouldn't feel badly. Yes, you can feel badly. And there are ways to feel badly and move through it and do constructive things with it. The thing we want to say about this, with all of these losses, whether they be death loss and non-death losses, things that in my field of dying, death, and bereavement, that things that we have previously identified as being what we call high risk factors, things that complicate people's grief. They are routine in the pandemic. A death that's sudden or that you might think is preventable, or that it occurs when there's other stresses going on, or where there's a lack of support, or where there's some violence involved. And by violence, it doesn't have to be violence to hurt, but violence to help, to be intubated, or perhaps an amputation, suffering, a death that wouldn't happen except for this having been introduced into your loved one's life, this virus. Deaths that are random, multiple deaths, deaths that are untimely. So things that we know for many years that cause challenges are now routine. So the bottom line is that you need to appreciate that you're being presented with many stressful things. There are definitely ways to manage these, and people can and do survive these. But the first step is in recognizing what you've been presented with.
Mm. So regardless of cause, every death, every loss is very complicated at this stage of the game. And so are there any other risk factors that present themselves at this challenging time?
Well, yeah, I think Terry has, Dr. Rando has mentioned many of those. I would just add a few. I think the lack of support is very, very important here. And again, with losses that are disenfranchised, like non-COVID deaths or non-death losses, that's critically important. I think we also have to examine a person's prior history, and obviously risk factors there would be history of anxiety reactions or depressive reactions, a history of those in mental illness, for example. We also have to look at relationships. What was your relationship with the person? Those that are highly conflicted, ambivalent, dependent, you love the person, but there's things about the person that really get to you, are more complicated than other kinds of losses. People may be forced to make ethical decisions. Dr. Rando hinted at those, whether to incubate or not, which may come back later on to cause guilt. Did we do the right choice? Did we add to the person's suffering? Was it a legitimate issue? There are all kinds of factors here. And again, I guess my key point would be that I want to make is, if you think you're having a hard time, you probably are. And seek help, whether it's seeking support or seeking self-help, and we'll be talking more about the kinds of self-help you can do in the next video, or whether it's seeking a counselor. The one really good thing about this period is that you don't need to grieve alone, so don't. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And so despite the challenges, there are a number of ways to cope. Please join us for our next installment of Coping with Loss During a Pandemic, the COVID-19 series, where we will discuss self-help strategies to cope with trauma and loss arising during this time. Thank you.